good afternoon and welcome to this really important Tri-Nations event, which focuses on a current and live issue, that of exploring system leadership. I don't think there's a more important leadership concept right now for us to be thinking about across our various jurisdictions. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Alma Harris. I'm from Cardiff Metropolitan University, and the sun is certainly shining here in Cardiff today. So it's a warm welcome to all of you. What I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is less of a lecture and more of a provocation. In the breakout groups, I'd really like you to think about some of the challenges, some of the issues, some of the, I think, definitional stresses around the idea of system leadership. So I wanted to start really by asking this very simple but profound question. Why is there so much reform around the world in our various education systems and so little change? And by so little change, I mean change that happens where it matters most, and that's in the classroom. What we see around the world in various systems, including Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and others, is a massive amount of change and reform. And yet, just like the seabed, there's lots of turbulence on the surface, but nothing dramatically changes. Now, the question that intrigues me is, why is that the case? Why is there so much reform and so little change? And it isn't the case, by the way, that the reform is ill thought through or not timely or not appropriate. There's something else happening in our systems. And my argument today is there's a lack of system leadership to actually embed some of these really good reforms into the system in ways that do make a difference to the classroom and do make a difference to the children and young people, you know, in terms of their learning and their life chances. So why so much reform and so little change? Well, there's a couple of reasons, I think, and it's pretty well documented in the international evidence base. And I'm not going to labor these points, but they're worth just thinking about. And if you reflect upon your own system and the sort of reforms that you're trying to implement right now, then here are some questions to think about. First of all, is there the readiness for reform? Often there's reform fatigue, where teachers and school leaders and others in the system are just tired with the pace of change, the nature of change, and the way in which change just seems like a bus. Several come along at 1 minute. So there's a question about the readiness for reform. Secondly, there's a question about the capacity to implement. You know, these reforms might be brilliant, might be exactly what the system needs. But if there is insufficient capacity within the system to actually embed it, to implement it, then those reforms very easily can get sidetracked or ignored and left, in a sense, to just be another thing that came along and wasn't properly fundamentally implemented. As Michael Fullan says, you know, the implementation process is way more important than the initiation or the innovation phase. Without implementation, really, nothing gets done and nothing changes. And the point that I wanted to make here this afternoon, which links to the idea of system leadership, is the third question: do we have the leadership infrastructure to ensure that the system is both responsive and enabling? In other words, is there leadership throughout the system at all levels that will allow the different reforms, different policies to be properly responded to? And that's where I think system leadership is such a critical phenomenon in terms of answering that question: why so much reform, so little change? Now, this review that I undertook for the National Academy for Education Leadership really does take a pretty hard look at the evidence base. And I'm not going to labor the evidence base too much in this talk, because you can read this review. But in a sense, by doing this piece of work, I became way more interested in what we don't know about system leadership, as well as some of the things that we do know. There seems to me to be quite big empirical gaps when it comes to knowing how system leadership works in practice, and more importantly, the difference that it makes in terms of the system, schools, and young people. But there is an international evidence base, and that's quite important to say. Some of it, however, is contradictory. Some of it is a bit confusing. Some of it is more theoretical than practical. But here it is. If you want to have a look at it after the seminar, then it's there and it's free to download. A couple of things just to sort of say from what I've read from the international work that's been done on this. So there's a lot of confusion that, and the terms system leadership and system leader sort of float around interchangeably. But leading the system is not the same as system leadership. And this is not just an issue of semantics, but it's quite an important, pivotal distinction. If you are leading the system, it doesn't necessarily by default make you a system leader. A system leader or system leadership adds significant value to what is already there. So just because you are a leader in the system, a principal or a head teacher, you are a leader in the system, that doesn't necessarily make you a system leader. There are other things that need to be in place, other conditions, other skills, other aptitudes, where in a sense, you know, added value is brought to the system. So it's not just the existing positions in the system, something else is going on when we talk about enacting system leadership. So let's just unpack that a little bit. You know, system leaders clearly occupy a place in the system. If we're looking at building system leadership capacity, then you need to designate who the system leaders are. And system leadership is really the art or the craft of mobilizing the system or parts of the system in a way that it's not currently mobilized. So that's the important point about the added value, the X factor, if you like, for those of you who watch it. That's what system leadership brings, is something else to the system to build that capacity that I talked about for change and delivery. And leaders in the system are not automatically system leaders. I've said that, but in the literature, if you read the literature, then sometimes there's a bit of confusion. People talk about system leadership and system leaders. And I think the two things are needed, but they mean distinctively different things. I think system leadership is the practice, and system leaders are the actors in the system that bring together, I suppose, that dynamic that makes system leadership able to add significant value to the system. So I'll sort of draw a little bit upon some of the things that I've written in the review, because they're quite important to get your head around, because otherwise, like a lot of the leadership literature, you know, you sometimes past each other when you're using terms. I'll talk about distributed leadership later. And one of the things we know about the leadership literature, which is vast, there is such a thing as adjectival leadership, which is simply where you put a new adjective in front of the word leadership, and hey presto, you've got a different concept, a different idea. Now, the question for me is system leadership just another adjective that you put in front of leadership, and hey presto, it's another idea? The evidence base would suggest not. Its theoretical lineage would suggest not, but it's worth just pausing and looking at what the writing so far has said about system leadership and system leaders. Again, they're not synonymous, yet often in the literature they're used interchangeably. And that, when you're reading the evidence base, can sometimes be a little bit confusing. So later on in the presentation, I've tried to sort that out by talking about the macro, which is the system leadership, and the micro, which are the system leaders. So the definitional overlap in looking at this concept doesn't help to really have a sense of precision or any sense of what in fact needs to happen to make system leadership a reality. Now, I'm not a big fan of blueprints. And if there was a blueprint for system leadership, I'd probably reject it, because the evidence also shows that it looks different in different contexts. And I'll talk about Singapore and Australia and Ontario a little later on. And the idea is that it's a dynamic within the system. And therefore in Wales, it will look very different from in Scotland, very different from in Ireland. And that is probably good, because the systems are culturally and structurally very different. So system leadership and system leaders have to be ultimately responsive to the context and the culture that they find themselves in. The final point from the review is there are different ways of understanding this, different ways of talking about it. Neither is right, neither is wrong. But understanding the complexity, I think, of system leadership gets us part way to knowing A, what it is, be what it does and what the impact is likely to be on a system where this exists to shape the capacity for change. So to understand system leadership, you've first got to understand system theory and system learning. The idea that, from social psychology, that learning is actually a group enterprise. You can learn on your own, but it's much better to learn collectively and collaboratively. And that's sort of at the heart of system theory, that systems are really complex, entities like organizations, but even more complex. They've got lots of moving parts. So the idea that you can somehow control the system, I think, is misplaced. You can infuse the system with ideas. You can try and enthuse the system with things to really engage individuals within it, but you can't really impose system leadership. And there are some examples around the world where that's blatantly failed, because in a sense, you can't impose upon the system. The system is the system. It has its own dynamic. Now, to get to the heart of system leadership, you've really got to understand distributed leadership in action. There's a lot of misrepresentation of what distributed leadership is. It's not delegation. It's actually quite a sophisticated form of leadership, where leadership is shared, leadership is collaborative, leadership is interdependent. Leadership is really about the practice of enacting leadership, not the roles and responsibilities. Now, this lateral form of leadership, I think, speaks directly to system leadership, because without this lateral form of leadership that really does build the capacity for change, then you're really looking at sort of a hierarchical structure. And sometimes, organizations don't function that well with hierarchical structures. Organizational change is a dynamic, it can, in a sense, it's part of the culture and structure of the organization. And the same is true of the system. Organizations can learn, we know that, okay? System theory tells us that, organizational theory tells us that. And the same is true for systems. Systems can learn. Their capacity to develop isn't fixed. It can be enhanced, it can be stretched, it can be developed. So the key thing here is, how do we enhance the leadership within our systems so it is enhanced, extended, and developed, so that we can become the best system that we can be. The key when you look at the theoretical perspectives and you look at all this sort of, the practical applications, it's that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, if you get within any system the different pieces working in alignment, the different pieces working together, the different pieces adding value, then the chances of you building system capacity are so far greater. And we've got examples of that around the world. So underlining the idea of systems theory and system leadership is really a very simple notion that collaboration is important, but the right collaboration, authentic collaboration, the right connections. Isolation is the enemy of improvement. We know that. You can only do so much as an individual. You can only do so much in isolation. So systems leadership speaks to the importance of the collective, the importance of engagement, the importance of inclusivity. Not necessarily as nice things to do, although I guess they are nice. It's the necessary things to bring about system change. That takes me back to my original question. Why so much reform and so little change? And the answer to that question is because there isn't system leadership to build the capacity for change. So underneath the idea of system leadership is the idea of relationships. And I guess underneath that also is the importance of trust. So you're trying, if you can imagine a Rubik cube, that's the system. And in many respects, it's about how you turn that Rubik cube, that is the system, that is complex, that has all these moving parts, into alignment, so that individuals are working across the system to make things far better for the system to improve. But without relationships, very little happens. We know that in any organization that we work in, that the quality of relationships actually dictates the quality of performance. And Stephen Covey Jr., the son of Stephen Covey, who wrote the 7 Great Habits of Leadership and then the 8 Great Habits of Leadership, you might have that on your bookshelf, wrote a really important book, and its title is fantastic, and I wish that I'd thought of it. And it's called The Speed of Trust. The Speed of Trust. And basically what it says is you can test the ability, the resonance of any organization or any system by the speed of trust. When that speed is high, things get done very quickly. When that speed is low, then reform and change is painful and sluggish. Unless you trust in the system and all parts of the system to work together, then the chances of making something happen that is significant are very low indeed. So distributed leadership is very much an emphasis on the collective processes. So I think in a way, system leadership and distributed leadership sort of speak to each other because they're both in the same leadership terrain. They're both talking about the importance of collaborative partnerships. They're both talking about leadership as a collective entity, not an individual role or responsibility. And they also talk about the importance of teams and team building. At the end of the day, nothing gets done without, collective effort and collective efficacy. Again, the research evidence on this is really strong. Collective efficacy really does impact upon organizational improvement, but also system improvement. But how do you get there? That's the $64 million question. Systems are not just like this, by the way. They've been created carefully. They've been nurtured. They've been supported. And they work in ways where this collective, set of relationships is very precious, but also the speed of trust is also very high. So what does this look like in action? Because as Kurt Lewin said, there's nothing quite as practical as a good theory. And I mean, we can all talk in theories, professors do this all the time. But the question is, what does it really look like on the ground? And I think we've got some examples of what it looks like. And I think we've got some really good examples of what it doesn't look like. We tend to know when you walk into a school, the culture is almost immediately palpable to you. And sometimes when you go into a system, an education system that's unfamiliar to you, very quickly you'll become aware of its culture. So what does system leadership look like in action? Well, let me just sort of separate out the two things I talked about earlier. There's the macro level, which is system leadership. That's the practice. And what we see in systems that have this, and they're not necessarily all the high performing systems, so let's not make that mistake either. Where education systems have this, it's essentially where the system sort of converges and where the system interacts and where there's a way of levering school and system transformation improvement. In essence, within the system, everybody is on the same page. Everybody knows what they're doing and they're doing distinctively different things, but their sort of main goal is the same goal. And they're, working together in productive relationships to reach that goal. So as a system, they're working together. And that sounds simple, but it's very, very complex to achieve with any authenticity. And then we've got the sort of the micro level. Now, the micro level is very much about system leaders. And this is where the semantics come in. So try and keep those two things sort of separate, but related in your heads. That's really, micro level leadership, system leadership does involve individuals taking on specific roles. Now, within the National Academy, we've got associates and they've taken on additional roles, from being a head teacher in the school or being another system leader, they've taken on additional roles. So here's the thing, where is the added value? And that's what you also have to ask yourself. Where is the added value from system leadership? What are they doing that is different from what they already did? Because if they're doing what they already did, then there's no added value to the system. They've got to be brokering, connecting, collaborating in ways that they were not doing before. So that infrastructure, which is nicely illustrated on this slide, it's about those connections and bridging and brokering those connections. So system leadership requires lateral engagement, agency, and empowerment. You can't dictate system leadership. You can't overmanage it. If you do, you stifle it. You've got to really empower the system by liberating some of these individuals to do this work in different ways and have a sense of agency and autonomy to bring about the magnitude of change that we're talking about. So here we've got, I guess, some ideas from the paper about the functions of system leaders, again, at the micro level, okay? They contribute to system leadership, but they're doing things at the micro level. And here's some of the things that I think these people do, and the evidence would support this. And I'm not going to read the list out, but you can see there that there's something here about activism, doing things differently, about change agentry, which is, you know, could be a cliche, but really bringing about change where change is perhaps not as optimum as it might be. It's about relationships, it's about trust, it's about facilitation. And system leaders need all these things in order to add some value to the system and to broker new opportunities. So here are the conditions that I think are really important for system leadership: to be authentic, to be impactful, to be powerful. And if you think about your own system right now, wherever you are in the world, there has to be trust. So, you know, what levels of trust are there within your system? Is it high? Is it medium? Is it low? What sort of coordination processes are in place to link different organizations? So there's that alignment that I talked about. You know, competition, I think, is also the enemy of improvement. If we're down in our bunkers, just protecting ourselves and ensuring that, you know, we are not sharing because the things that we're doing, we don't really want to share with other people, then that's a very fragmented system. And that's not system leadership. In fact, it's the antithesis of system leadership. You have to let there be leadership that is lateral. So head teachers, principals, leaders of other parts of the system need to be empowered in ways that allow them to take that step outside their role, to add that value that I'm talking about. There has to be some sort of collective responsibility. And really importantly, there has to be no blame innovation. So if you're going to ask these people to step outside their comfort zone, to do different things, to broker with other people, then you can't turn around and say, well, actually, that's not what we wanted. And that innovation has failed. So the no blame innovation is really important so that people feel able to take risks. Because at the heart of system leadership, it's not doing the same old thing. It is actually about risk taking. It is actually about stepping outside and doing something different within the system, with others within the system. So a couple of things just to say. In terms of system leaders, the micro level, they need clarity about the purpose, the expectations, and the responsibilities of those defined as system leaders. And this is a feature of countries where productive system leadership is in place. You know, you can't just become a principal or a head teacher yesterday and today you're a system leader. It doesn't work like that. It's really about a clear set of expectations, a clear set of practices, some support, and the responsibilities to take on board the change that I talked about. There is evidence of approaches to system leaders and leadership within different education systems. Some of it is successful, some of it is not. The mandated system leadership is not, because people feel it's a role, it's a responsibility, it's a checklist, they're part of the bureaucracy, they have no freedom to move, they have to do these things. Whereas there has to be a little bit of latitude to the role and the responsibilities. Yeah, a clear definition so they know what to do, but let's not straitjacket them with a long job description of things that they must achieve. This is about giving them the flexibility and maneuverability in the system to add that value that'll make all the difference. Now, in the paper, I talk about 3 examples. I don't hold them up as, you know, shining examples, but they are examples. Singapore is a tiny little system. If you've ever been to Singapore, its education system is tiny. It's a wonderful place to go to. But, you know, it's probably our best example of system leadership because of the movability between different roles. So you may be a principal one day, you may be in the ministry, you know, next, you may be back working I guess, in a university. So the roles within Singapore tend to be interchangeable. Now, we don't have any example quite like that in the bigger systems because they're more complex, it's more difficult. But that interchangeability of roles and responsibilities, I think, in Singapore does build significant capacity for improvement. There are other things going on in Singapore, of course, which I won't go into, but that's why I say you need to look at these as models and not exemplars. The two other examples are Ontario and New South Wales. And here you've got, again, very different systems on a very different scale, but they have invested in forms of system leadership, forms of working across the boundaries of organizations. They have invested in system leaders. So the idea in Ontario, New South Wales, and I haven't got time to go into this, is really about producing an infrastructure, a new infrastructure, where there can be new capacity built for change and the engagement of those within the system to realize that. So the evidence about the effectiveness of a system leadership or a system leader's approach is heavily context specific and dependent. You know, you can't predict. There is no blueprint, there is no panacea around this, but we've got more and more evidence that this form of leadership, if it's enacted properly, if it's invested in, if those in power release, I suppose, some of the levers, then it can have quite a dramatic difference on the way in which that system performs. But ongoing policy support is key. So you can't have system leadership in its authentic sense if everybody's holding firmly on to the policy levers at the top and not relinquishing any power or control. It becomes a counterintuitive and counterproductive exercise then. So you really need buy-in at all levels in the system for this to happen. So here's the important point. If we look around the world, you've got systems that are deemed to be high performing. I think that's contested, but let's just leave that to one side. And that results in what I call policy borrowing. You know, we'll borrow from Finland or Singapore, whatever. I would advocate that what we need is system learning. We need to look at what's working within our individual systems. We need to look at what's good within our individual systems, and we need to maximize that. So in other words, system learning and system leadership, not policy borrowing. There are barriers to system leadership. Of course there are, and these are some of those. And I've mentioned the fact that, you know, it's quite a dynamic form of leadership. So once you release this into the system, you probably have one chance actually of making this work in an authentic way. If people get a sense that this is in some way a manipulated model, then you're going to have some difficulties in getting that buy-in that I talked about earlier. So it isn't just good enough to label people system leaders without the support, without the empowerment, without the sense that this is actually a system priority. This is not something that's bolted on or added on or another new thing for principals or school leaders to do. This is the priority. This is the mode of travel, if you like, when it comes to system level change. Now, the practices that support system leadership, I've already talked about. And I think if you were to ask me a question, you know, what would our best system leaders be doing? It would be some of these things. And of course, you know, that's not suggesting that people within the system that are not system leaders are not doing these things. But these seem to be the activities that build those connections, build that next practice, not the best practice, the next practice, that results in the innovation and change that really does enable a system to move itself forward. So here's my sort of final comment, and then I'll let you think about what I've said. I think we make a mistake if we start labeling people as system leaders in a singular way. You know, they're system leaders and there are others. I think everybody in some respect has a leadership function within the system. Doesn't make them a system leader, but they have a leadership function. It's fundamentally about connecting the parts of the system that are not connected right now, today, right, that are fractured or broken or disparate, and connecting those parts together. So in other words, putting together the links so that organizations can start to work in collaboration, not competition. It does mean working across organizational boundaries. So the skills of a system leader are actually, quite important here, because it means brokering, it means negotiating, it means getting people on board to work with you in a new and different way. But ultimately, if we are successful, then system leadership is about creating new connections, new links. But ultimately, as I said at the start of this talk, it's about ensuring that whatever policies come into our system, there's the capacity, the will, the skill, and the persistence to deliver. And that will not happen without system-wide leadership. So I'll leave it there. I've got some questions here that you might want to think about in your breakout rooms, but thanks ever so much for listening. And I hope that some of this has sparked some ideas for further discussion and debate.